Who are you?
Show. That 90's show.
No. No way.
So Netflix recently released That 90's Show, a reboot series to, you guessed it, That 80's Show, That 70's Show, and I'm gonna be honest, it kinda sucked. Now, an important thing to know about me is That 70's Show is not only one of my favorite sitcoms of all time, but it's probably one of the few sitcoms that I like in general. As someone who has a very specific, weird brand of humor, the types of shows that the mainstream public is into when it comes to TV comedy is just very much not my thing. For example, back in high school, I remember some of my friends showed me a couple of episodes of Friends after I told them that I had never seen the show before, so they showed me what they considered to be some of the best episodes, and honest to God, I don't think I've ever been so unamused by something that is technically labeled as a comedy. And this is generally my feelings towards most sitcoms, not that I have anything against them or whatever, but with the exception to a handful of sitcoms, these types of shows are not really my thing. However, That 70's Show is one of the few mainstream sitcoms that I actually love, and a huge reason as to why this show is an exception to the many other swaths of generic laugh track driven sitcoms for me is that there was clearly a lot of talented, witty, funny, and most importantly, passionate people working on this show. This was a show that no matter what episode was on TV that night, I was basically guaranteed a fun 30-minute session, because with the exception of that god-awful final season, this is an incredibly consistent show that always delivers on jokes, visual gags, character interaction, and most of all, entertainment. This show has such a special place in my heart that when I first saw it in middle school, I looked up to the gang. I always dreamed of one day chilling with Eric and his friends in Red and Kitty's basement. It sounds corny to say that, but that's how much I loved the show. So when it was announced that Netflix was going to make a reboot of That 70's Show with That 90's Show, I was incredibly pessimistic. Not just because reboots of classic sitcoms and shows tend to fucking suck, but this was also going to be a reboot produced and streaming on Netflix, and last time Netflix did something like that, let's just say that it didn't produce great results. The teaser and trailer for this show didn't really do that much for me either. I was mostly unimpressed with or cringed at what I saw. Still, in honor of my love for the original series, I decided to give this show a chance and sat through all 10 episodes of its first season, and yeah, this wasn't good. Now here's what I'm going to say. As far as reboots of classic sitcoms and just shows in general, this was not as bad as I was expecting, as I've seen far shittier reboots than That 90's Show. But even though it wasn't as bad as I predicted it was going to be and my expectations for this series was incredibly low, I still can't help but feel disappointed. Because while a small part of me was really hoping that the trailers only showed the worst parts of the series and that this was going to be some unexpected surprise that would have lived up to That 70's Show, the rest of me was expecting some massive dumpster fire that I was expecting to hate and pour my entire anger and malice towards. But somehow That 90's Show managed to do neither. While I would not even remotely call this show good, I also wouldn't call it horrible either. The best way I can describe That 90's Show is that it is painfully mid. While there were a couple of moments that did get some chuckles out of me, this is a show that is overall so unfunny, so uninteresting, and worst of all, so disposable that I literally feel nothing when I watch, talk about, or pretty much have anything to do with this reboot. And honestly, I think that's the worst thing a show can be. Unlike That 70's Show where I can quote that series for days, its successor is so fucking lifeless that I can barely remember anything that happens in this entire series, much less quote the damn thing. You see, for me, when it comes to the entertainment I watch, I would rather watch something either amazing or amazingly shitty, and That 90's Show, while leaning towards shitty, is neither of these things. This show is so disposable and so unfunny that it honestly changed the type of video this was going to be, because originally I was going to make a quick 5 to 10 minute long video where I rant a bit about how much I hate this new reboot, but this series is just so insultingly disposable that it motivated me to change this into a more traditional long video essay where I compare and contrast the two shows in the same vein as my Avatar video, which you should go watch if you haven't seen, by the way, so buckle up because this one is a doozy. Point number 1, characters or the lack of them. So one of the major aspects of That 70's Show that is leagues better than this shitty reboot are the characters. You know, one of the most important things to make a fucking sitcom or just any show in general work. Part of my love for the original series comes from just how unique and distinctive each character is. Eric is the nerdy but lovable dork and leader of the group, Donna is the feminist tomboy, Jackie is the stuck-up rich girl, Kelso is the goofy dumbass man whore, Fez is the suave horny foreign kid, and alleged rapist, Hyde, is the rebel rocker boy. Each of these characters had a unique identity that made them who they are, and it's this contrast in personalities that made the character dynamics and interactions so fun to watch. You wouldn't expect such different personalities to gel well with each other, other, and the highlights of these interactions are definitely during these circle scenes, where the actors can really let loose and have fun while riffing off each other. There is a clear abundance of spark amongst the actors. You can clearly understand why all these characters are friends and hang out with each other because of this chemistry, and that's something that's just completely lacking in that 90's show. If this new series didn't constantly tell me that these characters are friends or do stupid dumb shit like this, then I would have had no idea that these new characters were friends with each other, much less know each other. They have so little chemistry, so little entertaining moments or scenes that they act less like friends and more like random strangers that are forced to spend time with each other. And I'm gonna be honest, the actors who play these characters fucking suck. They cannot tell a joke or say anything remotely funny if their lives depended on it. I mean, seriously, these characters are so uncharismatic and cringy to watch that I honestly cannot remember any of their names. That's how unmemorable they are. The only character whose name I can remember is Leia, but the only reason why I remember her name is because 1, she's the main character, 2, they repeat it like 600 times, and 3, it's a fucking Star Wars reference. Me remembering Leia's name has less to do with her personality or any jokes she says or the kind of character she represents or really anything that makes a character likable or interesting to watch. It's like they mashed all the boring, annoying qualities of Eric and Donna, went to the Disney Channel sitcom character generator, mashed that shit into the factory, and manufacturally produced this fucking kid. But at least I can remember her name. Take a look at these characters and see if you can remember their names. These are their names. They're so painfully unfunny and uninteresting to watch that it's kind of impossible to really pinpoint what about their characters I don't like. I just don't have anything to say. Most of this show, in terms of its new characters, are so vapid that they just entered my mind and then left seconds after entering it. The only new character that I can sort of remember is this guy, and while he's just as obnoxious and unfunny as the rest of the cast, at least he stands out from the rest because he at least emotes and has expressions, something that the rest of this new cast somehow lacks the ability to do. Like, yeah, he's still a stupid character because his only 2 character traits are that he's gay and he speaks French, but at least he does something somewhat differently from everyone else, or at least that's what I thought for about 2/3 of the show, but by the end of the series, that doesn't even matter anymore because for some fucking reason, everyone else starts trying to match this kid's level in terms of the screaming and yelling. There's just no consistency here. The characters' personalities are just whatever the fuck the writers deem they should be. There's just absolutely nothing about them that makes them special or engaging to watch. Unlike that 70's show where each character had their own unique quirks and have lines that sound and feel exactly like something they would say, the characters in that 90's show are so generic and interchangeable that they all talk and sound like AI-generated characters. And while you could blame the writing, a lot of that has to do with the actors as well, because if the only times these actors can emote or stand out are when they're shouting or screaming, then you've got a serious problem. I just don't believe a single thing that happens in this show. I'm not invested in a single character or plot point because the show doesn't give me a reason to. I don't believe a single word that comes out of these characters' mouths because the way these actors act and the way they communicate their lines feel less like genuine and entertaining performances and more like watching babies trying to act for a middle school play. It feels less like I'm watching a continuation of that 70's show and more like a shitty Disney Channel remake where the gang look, feel, and talk like they're on one of those shitty Disney Channel sitcoms, only except this time they can drink beer, smoke weed, and commit sexual assault. It's so fucking artificial, which I guess leads me to my next point. Point number 2, lack of authenticity. Now, I'm gonna be honest, I'm a pretty young guy. I was not alive during the 70's nor the 90's, so I have no idea whether both series accurately represents their respective time periods that they're portraying. However, even if I wasn't alive during either decade, I don't have to be fucking Doc Brown to figure out which show feels authentic and which one feels phony. Part of the charm of that 70's show is that even though it kind of serves as a parody of 70's sitcoms, the creators of this show and the people working on it still took the time to make it so period accurate that at times it would feel like we're looking through a time window and seeing actual average day life shit that happened back in the 70's featuring these characters. While they were able to pull this off through the obvious stuff like production value, costume design, and makeup, they also made sure to go the extra mile and tackle specific social and political themes that feels authentic to the time period. For example, the show addressed a lot of political and social issues that were pertinent in the 1970's, such as Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon after he resigned from the presidency, the sexual revolution in the 1970's where young Americans felt felt liberated in exploring their sexualities, the generational conflict between older and younger Americans, the economic hardships of the 1970s recession, mistrust of the American government by blue-collar workers, etc. The series also highlighted developments in a lot of pop culture at the time as well, particularly the entertainment industry, as the show played around with a lot of pop culture-related phenomenon like VCR and cable TV reruns, video games like Pong and Space Invaders, and of course Eric's obsession with Star Wars, which came out the same year as the first season. That 70s show felt authentic in that they made a series that looks and feels like a sitcom that could have existed in the 70s, as it not only made a lot of the situational humor and visual gags much funnier, but it also has a clever way of utilizing sitcom tropes without having it feel corny or irritating like laugh tracks. And this dedication to authenticity is just not in this reboot, because while on paper that 90s show tries to commit to the same level of authenticity by having what I'm assuming to be period-accurate fashion, technology, pop culture, and language, this is all just kind of surface level and the bare minimum if you think about it, because in that 70s show they use the current and political social trends of the 1970s to build their storylines, but in that 90s show they just put it in the 90s because reasons, I guess? Because all the actors are old as fuck and the 00 show wasn't as catchy of a title, I guess? Like, if I had no idea what this show was called or I'd never seen that 70s show and didn't know that this was a reboot to that series, then I would have had no idea that this show took place in the 90s. I mean, yeah, they used these big-ass cell phones because no one was whipping out iPhones and no one is doing any modern cringe memes like dabbing or whatever, but this show is just so fucking lazy with its 90s aesthetic that you could have easily told me that this show took place in either the 80s or the early 2000s, and I would have totally believed you. The only times where this show actually used its 90s setting to build storylines and further its plots was this one single episode where old-ass Red and Kitty have to get their old asses out of ancient times and learn how to use the computer, which is just the laziest shit fucking ever, because one, this is not a concept unique to the 90s, as every sitcom you could possibly imagine ever has used this same joke when it comes to old people trying to learn to use technology. It's basically a fucking cliche at this point. And two, the 90s were a really important era from a political, social, technological, economical, and pop cultural perspective, as there were so many moments that defined that era. And while I understand that the 90s was when the US experienced the internet boom, there were so many cool ways to go about this phenomenon, as it was such a big deal, but instead they just do the most cliched, boring, by-the-numbers shit ever. Unlike that 70s show where it felt like both a 70s sitcom and a parody of a 70s sitcom, that 90s show doesn't feel like either. This show feels less like a parody of 90s sitcoms and more like a sitcom parody, but in the worst way possible. Like, this is the kind of sitcom Abed would have made fun of in Community. It's that kind of bad. The people running this goddamn show are just so lazy and just don't give a fuck, which leads me to my next point. Point number 3, the little stuff. So before I started writing the script for this video, I went back and rewatched that 70s show because as much as I love that series, I didn't want my blind nostalgia to be the driving force of this analysis. So it was important that I make my argument with fresh eyes and memories of the original series. However, I also know that comparing 7 seasons worth of television to just a 10-episode first season wasn't exactly a fair fight, so to make it as equal as possible, and honestly to make my job easier, not only did I only rewatch the first season of that 70s show, but I only rewatched the first 10 episodes of the first season, and holy shit is the comparison between the two just night and day. Now, I've already talked about how the characters in the original series are a million times better than the characters in this shitty reboot, but one thing I left out in that section are the other things that make the comedy in that 70s show just so much funnier than that 90s show, and that's what I'm calling the little stuff. This includes stuff like directing, visual gags, the way jokes are said and presented, etc. Just anything that isn't just characters spewing jokes at the audience, and when I started noticing all these little things play out so incredibly well in that 70s show, it kind of highlights just how soulless that 90s show is, because all this stuff I'm talking about that was pertinent in the first 10 episodes of the original series is just basically non-existent in this reboot. You see, one of the things I noticed in my rewatch of the original series is just how kind of ambitious the directing is, and I'm not talking about the directing involving the circle scenes, though those scenes in of themselves are impressive and hilarious to watch. I'm more talking about the directing outside of those scenes. For example, in the pilot of that 70s show, Eric is peer pressured by his friends to steal beer from the party upstairs hosted by Red and Kitty, and rather than doing some generic bullshit, the show actually transitions into first person where the camera is shot from Eric's perspective. Through his eyes, we navigate through the party, learn a bit of all the supporting characters like Bob and Kitty, and even squeeze in some funny bits, all in this one take before it switches back to the traditional way sitcoms are shot. shot. That 70's show didn't have to shoot that certain section like that, but the fact that they did shows just how committed and passionate the people working on this show were to making this great. And while it's not the most groundbreaking thing in the world, for a TV sitcom, seeing film techniques like this is kind of unheard of even to this day. But then you compare that to that 90's show and there isn't a single moment like that POV shot in the pilot, and while I'm not saying that this reboot needed to do something exactly like that, I would have expected some level of attempt at interesting direction considering how committed its predecessor was to having an interestingly directed sitcom. There are a lot of really cool visual gags and interesting scene structures in the original series like this. Or this.
Okay, baseball, Vietnam, Richard Nixon, Pat Boone, the girl that does the weather. No. Okay, jellyfish, really big spiders. Come on, dig deep. Okay. The day we backed over Skipper in the driveway, instead of going to the county fair, I had to bury him in the backyard. Okay.
That not only made jokes even more hilarious, but are in of themselves interesting ways of presenting jokes. But no, that 90's show said, fuck that, let's just do pretty much every generic trope and cliche and boring direction that every sitcom on the planet has ever done ever. The only real interesting bits of direction are when that 90's show does its own version of the circle, where the camera swivels between characters as they're smoking that devil's lettuce. But that 90's show attempt at doing the same thing just doesn't feel the same. Now, for those who somehow don't know, weed was a central part of that 70's show and the interactions that occurred between the characters, but at the time, Fox had forbade the actual depiction of using the drug in the show. So in a really cool way that both abided by Fox's censorship rules without actually depicting weed itself, that 70's show utilized the now famous circle camera technique, where they swiveled the camera back and forth as a very subtle and super creative way of indicating who had the joint. Whichever character the camera was focusing on was an incredibly clever way of indicating who was holding the joint, and has become one of, if not the most defining moment of the show. But in that 90's show, not only is the inclusion of this camera technique just so much more boring and uninteresting to watch, but if you really think about it, there's really no reason to actually use this technique anymore, because this isn't the network television or Daily Wire where a showrunner would have to be incredibly clever and sneaky to indicate something like the usage of weed without pissing off the boomer audience and producers. This is fucking Netflix. They have a ton of shows about drugs right now that are way more open and upfront when it comes to drug usage, so there's no real need to use this camera technique anymore. They can just show the teen smoking pot, and honestly, that would have not only benefited the show a bit in terms of standing out from its predecessor, but it might even make some of the attempts at humor just a little funnier. It just feels like the only reason why this camera swivel technique is even in this show is because that 70's show did it. And in my opinion, doing something just to get nostalgia points from your audience is the laziest and most cynical reason to do something, which I guess leads me to both my final point and my conclusion. And point number 4, nostalgia bait is bullshit. Remember at the beginning of this video where I explained that as far as shitty, soulless, cash grab reboots go, I've seen worse than that 90's show? Well, the reason why I said that is because in spite of everything that I hate about this series, I would be lying if I said this show didn't get a chuckle out of me every now and then. Along with all these disposable Disney Channel-ass actors, Kurtwood Smith and Deborah Jo Rupp return as Red and Kitty, and are just as much as part of the main cast as the new characters, and while they're not exactly working with the best scripts, they seem like they gave it their all with what they have. While not every joke Red and Kitty made landed with me, I at least chuckled every now and then at some of their jokes, and as much as I try not to be a dumb gamer brain nostalgia baby, I can't help but smile whenever Red says dumbass or Kitty does her adorable laugh. And on top of that, all the cameos featuring characters from that 70's show were for the most part kind of amusing. Eric and Donna were just as quick-witted as I remember them being from the original show, Kelso screaming, and Jackie screaming, "Let's go, Michael!" always puts a smile on my face. All the scenes involving Fez and her hair salon business are never not entertaining to watch, and pretty much anything that Tommy Chong's character Leo says is just pure gold. These cameos and returning characters were pretty much the only moments I found funny in this entire show, and while I'm mostly being positive when talking about all these cameos, this is still an incredibly negative and terrible aspect of this reboot, because if none of the new characters or storylines or concepts or really any of the new shit in general isn't funny or entertaining to watch, and the only parts of this show that I enjoyed are just references to the previous show, then you have tremendously fucked up. Now look, there's nothing wrong with using callbacks and cameos and references and whatever the fuck when you're making a follow-up to something successful. I think if used both sparsely and effectively, and make sure that they never take priority over the new original story you're telling, nostalgia and remember that moments can be powerful tools to enhance a follow-up to a successful story. A perfect example of this would be something like Better Call Saul or BioShock Infinite. These are both amazing narratives that manage to both tell their own unique original stories that are in of themselves interesting in spite of what came before, but also utilize references and callbacks and characters of what came before to enhance what's going on, though only at the right moments and sparsely throughout. But in that 90's show, they spammed the shit out of these cameos episode after episode to the point that they no longer feel special anymore, but they constantly take away from what should have been the real priority of this show, and that's building the new characters and giving them interesting arcs and stories to follow. It's like instead of doing the logical thing, which is finding a new story and characters in the world of that 70's show, and then sprinkle in the cameos afterwards once you have something that works, it seems like they did the exact opposite, where they just came up with the references and remember that moments first, and then made the new shit up as they went along. This is not how you write a fucking continuation. The main takeaway from that 90's show shouldn't be the characters from that 70's show popping up to get some laughs and reactions. It should be the new cast of characters, the jokes these characters say, the plot lines these characters follow. The cameos shouldn't have been the only thing I found amusing. They should have been appetizers, not the main course. If I bought myself a cake and I found out that while the frosting was pretty good, the actual cake itself was shit, then you have made a terrible fucking cake. If a cake is fundamentally shit at its core, that you actively need to rely on frosting to make the taste bearable, then no amount of frosting will change just how shitty that cake tastes. You need to start over, do it again, do it better. God damn it, all this cake talk is making me hungry, so I'm gonna go eat and not think about this pathetic excuse of a reboot, which won't be a hard thing to do anyway. If there's going to be a second season, then I would prefer the people working on this show just start from scratch and actually write some fucking jokes and entertaining storylines. Netflix, you need to give me a reason to watch a second season of this shit, because otherwise I have no reason to watch this show anymore. I'll just watch all the cameos you'll ram-fist in the second season on YouTube if this is what the rest of the show is going to be like, because those will be the only parts I'll find entertaining, thank you very much. Make something that's actually funny and not a soulless disposable cash grab. Do it! I gotta go. This show's a 3 or 4 out of 10, I don't know, I don't care. Thank you and goodbye.